Okay, great. Okay, welcome. Well, this is the last installment of the multifamily homebuyer webinar course that we're doing live and recording this summer with lots of guest presentations. So I am Meg Stelp. I'm with Brattleboro Development Credit Corporation Southern Vermont Economy Project. And this series was envisioned and co-hosted by Windham and Windsor Housing Trust this summer. And we did a previous version of it back in January of 2022, but actually some things have changed since then. So we've offered to do this again. So I'm just going to let our guests introduce themselves. Why don't we just start with, you guys can just go one by one. So whoever wants to go first.
You know what? Yeah, and if you'd like, I can at least progress this to the screen that has our names on it. Does that work?
Yeah, there we go. That's
Okay.
great. Okay.
And by the way, I'm
are.
sorry, I can't see any of your faces, or I don't think I'll be able to see hands being held up. So if you could facilitate that, just interrupt me.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. So we've got Dan Handy, we've got Dunbars, we've got at least one Dunbar here, and we've got Susan Bellville with us live tonight. And if you guys want to just go around and say who you are.
Sure, I'll start. I'm Dan Handy. I'm the landlord liaison in Brattleboro, and I'm based at Groundworks Collaborative.
Great. John, you want to say a word?
Sure. I'm John Dunbar. My twin brother, Jeff Dunbar, and I own Whitaker Properties, which is, we have 16 rental units in Bellows Falls, Vermont. And we've been investing in real estate since about 2014, just looking to continue to improve housing in our local area. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, you're what we call like a small developer, even because you own several properties and take an interest in developing those to their full potential and making them good places to live, which is terrific. And Susan, do you want to say hello?
Hi, yes, I'm Susan Bellville. I guess my primary job has been for a number of years Bellville real estate, but I also own my own buildings. I've owned 3 buildings with 17 units in them that were single occupancy rooms, and I'm selling off a couple of those, but in the meantime, I've picked up property management, and I currently manage a building on Elliott Street that contains 17 apartments and 4 commercial spaces, and 2 other 3-unit buildings that I manage for the owners, 3 apartment units in 2 other buildings. So I've had a lot of experience.
That's great. No, that's really great. So why don't we just kick it off? So you guys can kind of just take it off, and I'll be here to kind of MC and ask questions and that I have and that I think other people might have too. So and just get into it.
Yeah, and I just want to mention David DeAngelis may not be able to join us. I hope he can join us a little bit late if he does. Great. Well, I guess I wanted to just say first, as we were discussing before we started recording, this is sort of a prelude or an incentive to get you to go back and watch the other presentation from January 2022 that we did as part of this course. In fact, watch all 4 of them, of course, but the landlord-tenant relations presentation that I did then with John and Jeff was a lot of information all at one time and trying to do some interactive things. This is going to be much more, at least attempting to facilitate a discussion with the speakers at the least. I don't believe, do we have participants who would?
It doesn't look like we have live participants, but we will, share the recording so people can respond to that. And I'm just putting into the chat, I'll just pile some links in there that have links, and then we'll get those published along with this recording so that people can go in and find those. So we've got up there the link to the past programming and resources that has all the materials, and then we'll share out the previous presentation as well. So
Sounds
people
good.
have access to that.
Great. So without getting too much into this, I do have a little visual here of one of the documents that you might be referring to, which is was published in 2015. It was actually updated in 2016. It's called The Definitive Guide to Renting in Vermont. It was written by a team representing tenants and landlords, Angela Zykowski from the Vermont Landlord Association and CVOEO's tenants organization in Burlington. And that was Pamela Favreau-Segaro. It's a very comprehensive guide, and I recommend looking at that, but we're not going to cover everything that's in there, especially legal stuff. We're going to focus on basically the safety concerns or the safety issues that some landlords who are becoming a landlord might want to discuss. It makes sense?
That's
But
great.
so there's a lot that we're not going to talk about today, but of course there might be questions about it. I just want to say a quick word. My office is at Groundworks Collaborative, and part of the reason that I've gotten feedback since January of 2022, and especially since April of this year, when we had a very unfortunate situation with one of our employees actually being murdered in the community. I just want to emphasize that safety really is a priority, of course, for tenants and for landlords, but we're going to focus on landlords, and I'll leave it at that. So there's a key concept that I just want to emphasize, and it sounds academic, but I think it'll be very practical. What you're looking at is like a barbell, right? And it's got two sides to the barbell. This is a symbol of what's considered asymmetrical, in this case, weights, right? But actually what we're going to use this to refer to is to refer to information and communication. So just to give you a little quote about this sort of asymmetry, when information is asymmetric, the incentives are for the party with more information to mislead the other. That's a quote from Nassim Taleb's book Skin in the Game, another book another reading I would recommend if you're thinking about becoming a landlord. It's not explicitly about landlording, but the idea is that landlords have information, tenants have information, and there's often a sharing of that information, but still the tendency really is for, on either side, for human beings anyway, in general, to take advantage of asymmetrical information, and that can lead to safety consequences, would be my basic pitch to you, not only to read that book, but to follow along and consider some of the safety topics we're going to talk about. This is just a sort of a, fun little image, but we'll come back to it at the very end. It's also, as I've said, based upon comments and concerns brought to me by local landlords since this was presented in January of 2022. My work primarily has to do with, as you can see in this little visual, what we call support works, which has to do with case managers working with Groundworks clients, and housing works, which has to do with housing, as you might imagine. If you're not familiar with Groundworks Collaborative, I do encourage you to check out the website. But essentially the tagline there, basic needs met with dignity, has to do with working with vulnerable members of the population who have all of the needs that you can see in that little visual, but primarily who are experiencing homelessness. Okay, so I am sorry for the list here. I'm not going to do the whole animations of how the bullet points can fly in there. But this is, I'm going to come back to this outline. This is just, I'm going to focus on numbers 1 and 2 to get started with. And at this point, I'm going to turn over the a little bit of, to get some of the speakers involved here. When I get to number 1, that's the next slide. That's going to use a couple of images from that previous presentation in 2022. And then we'll talk a little bit about the landlord mindset. And we'll come back to 3, 4, and 5 after that. Okay. So these are images, and I wanted John or Jeff or Sue to comment on, just this idea that we covered in that 2022 presentation of what makes a good landlord and what makes a good tenant. Of course, you can see one of the major words in both of those is being respectful. And I wondered if either John, Jeff, or Sue might just comment about this. This was gathered, as you might remember, during that presentation from the participants. These are word clouds that represent what people might think of when they think of a good landlord or a good tenant.
So,
Any comments about those?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that, go ahead, Susan.
no. Okay, so when I first got into being a landlord, there's 2 dynamics going here. Number one, I never really had any experience with landlord tenant stuff. I always owned my own home for as long as I can ever remember. And as a woman being a landlord, you come to believe that it is a position of power because it's your building, but you're renting it to people. And the impulse is to try to be in charge each time you have an interaction with a tenant, that you're in charge, it's your way. And I discovered that was not successful, that I lost a lot of ground with people, that they needed to know that I respected them, that I wasn't coming at it from the bully position, that I really did care what they thought and what their issues were, so that we had a pleasant dialogue. And I think that I expect that from tenants too. I expect them to be respectful of me as well as the property. So that's the key word for both positions, both parties. Be respectful, and then everything else will work out just fine, pretty much.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Susan said. And, it's, I think we spoke in the January meeting about that term landlord versus housing provider. And that can be pretty important. And, and that's the way, we try to look at it, that we're providing housing, and that housing should be to a quality that we're willing to live in. And if we're not willing to live in that, then you sort of have to ask yourselves, what are you expecting from the tenants if you're not willing to provide them something that's livable to your standards? And so, I think in a lot of these words that are up there about, being honest, having integrity, and all of these things, just if the tenant sees that all you do is collect a rent check and you're not making improvements to the building, you're not responding to any requests to repair things or take care of any inconveniences that a tenant has, then that's all that they're going to see. And that's all they're going to think, is that it's their money is just going into your pocket, and it's not benefiting them other than they have a place to live. And in today's market, when there are not very many places to move to, they can really feel like they're stuck. They don't have a lot of
Disrespected, correct?
options. Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
I think that we've certainly found that by being present more, by responding quickly, by making improvements, and they don't have to be huge renovations. Certainly, if you're able to do those sort of things, most tenants are going to appreciate that. But it's just when they have a concern and you respond to it, you take care of it, you update the apartment, then they really have a sense that, wow, the money that I'm paying every month is benefiting me, and my landlord cares about me. He cares about the building. And so, yeah, I think all of those things and all of these words that are represented and what makes a good tenant, what makes a good housing provider, those are keys.
Yeah, if I may, I thank you both for saying, for uh, giving us a sense of your own experience, because I think the major point I'm trying to make here is that this is a two-way street, right? There is a balancing act, and we are making or becoming good landlords, and good tenants can become good tenants at the same time. But the opposite of these things are true as well, right? People can become disrespectful, uncaring, right? All the opposites of these words. And that's where things become less attractive for both parties, I think.
Well, and that's where respect is probably the key word versus caring, because you have to be firm and manage expectations, and yet reinforce the fact that you care about them as people and as tenants, and you care about the building, and making sure that one doesn't outweigh the other, like you don't care more about one than the other, that you care about the whole package. And part of how I try to convey that to people is that it's not, particularly in the larger buildings, it's not just you, it's all these other families in the building that expect the same stuff. And we're working on this as a small community, to keep everyone happy so that they feel safe in their homes and they feel safe with us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've said this to all of you at one point or another, but I think this is something, this balance that we're talking about is something that especially Southern Vermont landlords do really well. I would say all of Vermont, but most of my experiences in Southern Vermont. And I really think that the reputation of bad landlords or bad housing providers, if you will, comes from a lot of parts of the country where we can really make a difference, in terms of in influencing, how we can turn this relationship in a positive direction. So that being said, I'll move on to the next topic, which is maybe the less.
Yes.
And again, apologies, I'm not using animations. It's all there, but I will walk through the bullet points. Basically, becoming a landlord has to do with, I would say, adopting a mindset. And as Sue mentioned earlier, when you first start out, you may make mistakes, and you may just have a different sense of your own self in this position. I'm going to make the case that you would want to think of this as a workplace safety issue or series of issues, and that you have needs in your workplace or in your occupation. Some people consider being a landlord a job. Some people consider it, a profession. Some would not. Some just call it a business, right? Let's just call it, for lack of a better word, an occupation in the real estate industry. And I think in general, if you're reading this material, or if you're watching this video, you are aware that you need training and you need to share information with other people in in this industry. So that's one of the most valuable things you can do to improve your sense of this being a workplace. I don't want to look at the worst case scenarios all the time, of course, but we do need to think about them whenever we think about workplace. That, let's say all the occupational safety stuff, the basic idea is to look at worst case scenarios and then work up from there. But also, on the other hand, to look at your needs as a human being, right? If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs pyramid, we know that, of course, we all have basic physiological needs, one of which is shelter. But the next one, of course, is safety. If we don't have that foundation, the others are very difficult to meet. And this includes being a landlord safely, identifying in terms of priorities of that workplace, identifying hazards to you personally. Where are you vulnerable? What are the risks that you face in doing this as an occupation? And that might include just that list right there. In today's day and age, there are social safety issues and issues of social media. You might want to decide what to do in terms of social media. And I would like some input on that from Sue and Jeff and John. Other safety issues, physical issues of maybe you want to think about how much distance you want between you and someone else when you're in their presence. Psychological safety in terms of the types of language that you're willing to accept in your presence, basically. Financial safety, that's pretty obvious, but it's obviously very difficult to articulate that for anyone. So you'll have to decide on that. And then property safety in terms of what the physical layout of your building or any unit is. Would anyone else like to chime in on some of these issues?
So one of the things is I don't talk about real estate nor my rental properties on social media. I don't talk about other people that I interact with in those areas on social media. It's social media is that it's social. It's not work. And being a landlord and being a real estate broker, that's work. But there are tenants who talk on social media. And I have to learn to not be sensitive to some of the things that are said. And I have to understand the context in which they're said. But I may find an opportunity to talk with them and help understand why they felt that way, that they had to blast social media.
Yeah.
So far as physical distance, I think COVID was a real good teacher what that means. I've always been somewhat careful about personal space. And I've told you, Dan, a couple of instances where I felt unsafe and stuff that has happened.
Mm-hmm.
That's a tough call. That really is, you have to pay attention to your instincts in order to keep from becoming an issue. John, go ahead.
Yeah, no,
I
think you're right. And you said earlier about, stating your expectations up front. And I think that's really important when you, if you're just becoming a landlord or you have a new tenant, and you've been a housing provider for a while, just explaining to that new tenant exactly what your expectations are, documenting that as well, giving them something that they can refer back to, not just saying it the day that you're signing a lease and they're handing over their deposit and, first and last and security deposit, so, making sure that those are set, that you live up to those. And sometimes that is, and when you brought up the financial aspect, Dan, we certainly understanding that there are a lot of people in our communities that pay. Sorry, I'm seeing that my internet is unstable, so if it's hopefully it's coming through okay. But if the there's so many people that are paying a significant portion of their income for housing, and that's not just renters; those are homeowners as well. And certainly with the economics recently, it's becoming harder and harder, and people are being challenged more. So letting people know that you understand that, that that things can pop up. Maybe there's they have car troubles and they've got to put some money towards repairing their car. But letting them know that, yes, they're committed to paying you rent, but that you're a human being too, and you understand that things happen and you have things happen in your own life. And that, but just explaining, look, just tell me if you are in trouble and you aren't going to be able to pay rent. Tell me the issue. Tell me when you can pay rent. Stick to that. Don't just tell me that you'll have it in a few days, and then a few days come and I still don't have rent. I'm still wondering when. And so that honesty that we talked about a few slides ago, be upfront. Let them know what your expectations are. Let them know that whether you choose to be very hard line, it's due on the first of the month, no excuses, or whether you say, we know that things come up. And if they come up, please bring it to our attention as soon as you know it comes up. And then tell us what your game plan is to follow through, to make your commitment, to show me that you are committed as a tenant, that you understand I have commitments on my own end to pay the bills for the building and to provide the services and things that they need. And then also as a new tenant, or as a new landlord, and also as you get a new tenant, and Dan mentioned things like language that you'll accept when people are using language around other tenants or in front of you. Just understanding that that new tenant is coming from a different experience. They're moving from a different building. They may have allowed certain things that you are not going to allow. And so when they're behaving in a way that you wish that they wouldn't, explaining that, and giving them an opportunity to change that behavior. We've certainly had people in the past that some of the language that they've used, the way they've behaved, the way they've raised their voices, we've been firm. That's not allowed. Here's what I expect from you. And the next time we have an interaction that may be, it's just a heightened situation. This is how I expect you to behave, and this is how I'm going to behave. And in most cases, that's absolutely worked. They tend to have that, wow, I really respect that person. They didn't go off on me. They didn't yell at me. They didn't threaten me. They didn't threaten to evict me. It was just, here are the expectations. Here's how I will be. Those are pretty important things that can happen. And as you said, it's a relationship. And just as other relationships that you have in your professional life and personal life. So, yeah, Meg.
I have a question. Well, my question is, I guess, is there a good way when you are like interviewing a new tenant or, getting to know them to sort of express that? I mean, I don't know, if there's like legalities around that, but if you can sort of, do you have a way of explaining, either of any of you, like sort of the character of the building? Like, this is a building, we have some families. I mean, are you allowed to talk about kind of the mix of the building and what's expected, and that, or not? I don't know what's allowed, but I feel like that might be a good way to phrase it when people are moving in, by sort of describing like the community that they would be moving into, and just say, we have, kids downstairs, and so you can't be, blasting the music after 9 o'clock or whatever. I don't know how much, so if there's legal issues there, or there are ways that you kind of bring that up. And I think you know, in a way that might be a good way of helping create community in the building, but it also establishes kind of a reason for. So I don't know if there's legal issues around that or whether you can do that when you're interviewing someone, how much you can ask them and how much you can tell them.
Meg, if I may, we're going to have a chance to talk a little more about, I think what you're talking about is some very specific points of communication. And which are like at the time of screening and the time of inspections and so forth. And I think that we might be able to touch on some of that, but I while you've asked the question, at the same time, I want to encourage anyone else to give some feedback.
Yeah, I certainly do. When we're interviewing a candidate for a for an apartment, I'll let them know about the neighborhood, and about the building and the types of people, maybe, if there's someone that as Meg was saying, like maybe there's somebody that works nights and sleeps during the day, and that those are part of those expectations. And oftentimes those are things that are just written in the lease about how you're going to behave as a tenant. And also I think that there's a lot of things that you can do in your interactions with them, again, just to talk about the expectations that you have of not only them, but also the rest of the tenants in the building, that you're not singling them out. These are expectations that you have of everyone.
Yeah, when I'm interviewing people and I have a situation where the tenant may work nights and be trying to sleep during the day, and this person that I'm interviewing doesn't have that same shift interest or shift stuff, I will ask them if it would be a problem for them, if it would interfere with their life to try to respect the tenant that they're next to, or that could, if it could affect them. One of the other things too, John, when you were talking about language and interaction and how the tone goes, when people start to get really testy with me and start to raise their voice or start using really abusive language, I will tell them that I can't hear them very well over this this emotional reaction, and we really need to tone it down so that we can have a discussion, that they're not getting their information out there if they're using really, if they're just being emotional about the event rather than trying to have a conversation. In my building with 17 families, I make that crystal clear that we have families, we have people with children, we have single moms, we have people who work nights, people who work days, people who don't work at all. But they have to be respectful of everybody, and it's important for the whole building that everyone is feeling safe.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, and I'm going to throw in a sort of a simple word, but I think it's mediation. Essentially, is what we're kind of doing as landlords or housing providers. Sometimes you're mediating between tenants, but you're also what I'm just, for the sake of this discussion of discussing, becoming a landlord, it is a decision I think that anyone needs to make about, whether they feel comfortable in this sort of workplace. That was my basic point with this one, but all good points. Thanks, everybody. So we'll go on to just, I think that the one of the unsaid dynamics that Sue already mentioned is that there is there's already this context of people creating social media, for example, or other backgrounds in their lives. One example, for sake of partially for your edification, are articles like this one on mymove.com about shady landlords. There's always a story out there. But the National Association of Realtors does have recommendations about, of course, for realtors, but specifically for property management and landlording. And some of the basic ideas are that we are all at different times of the day, in different spaces, in different places, we're vulnerable. And so we do need to think through what your own personal safety strategy would be as a landlord. So for example, when you are screening tenants, I think Sue mentioned this, about Facebook and so forth. You probably can find out a lot nowadays about tenants from social media, and they can find out a lot about you, as Sue has mentioned. Let's just park that to the side, but screening is a very vulnerable time for both you and the landlord, and the tenant, is my basic point. And that you, however, are the one who's setting the tone for that, for any of these times of vulnerability. So what you might want to think about is sort of like office safety, where you have protocols for things like showing vacant rentals. What sorts of practices, what sort of protocols would you ideally follow when you're showing a vacant apartment to essentially a stranger? And before you do that, what would you want to know about this person? And I'm not going to talk about applications, but I do highly recommend having written applications that you then clarify in some way before you meet with the potential tenant. And then during the tenancy, you should be inspecting the unit, and you're inspecting for safety issues and for damage, but you're also considering, okay, where is this going? Right? What's my timeline here with this particular unit and this particular tenant? And it really comes down to, as I think we've all alluded to, the idea of your own instincts come into play here and how much you prepare. So I'll open that up for comments. But if I may, I'm going to just go to this outline here. We are going to cover problem tenant ideas, working with tenants, contractors, and officials, and then communication after this. But we'll stick with this one for a second.
So probably the biggest thing that I do is I pre-screen tenants before I'll even show them the property. Number one, we can step back to the financial piece of it. In this particular market, people are so desperate for a home that they will try to portray or try to convince you that they're financially able to purchase, to rent a property. And it's your job to make sure you've got a tenant who really can pay. And so you do the pre-qualification, you do the screening through the application, check out some of the references even, and yes, check out their social media accounts before you ever meet them at a vacant unit. That will help you a lot, and pay close attention to your instincts. Yeah, as a real estate person, we get informed a lot about remember your personal safety, protect yourself, be cautious, take safety measures. So that's kind of ingrained for me, but as a brand new landlord or housing provider, you need to be very cautious. Often people are way too trusting because they want to believe what they hear and not necessarily what they see. So you need to be very careful and think about it 2 or 3 times before you put yourself in physical harm's way.
I don't think I have anything to add to that, Dan.
Yeah, it's the basic consideration though is, we all know that these things are real, but preparing yourself is, well, not, sometimes it's just on the job where where you're learning. But being prepared ahead of time is certainly not a bad idea.
Well, and as a landlord, if I feel that I'm heading into a less than ideal situation, I may bring company.
There you go. Yeah, that's the kind of protocol that I'm talking about. Yeah, what would you, if you do have to go alone, call someone,
Mhm.
tell or text someone that you're where you are. I mean, all the basic things, but it is easy, I think, as you said, to just
Even have
in
somebody do a
general
phone check-in
not
with you. Yeah.
not consider those safety precautions.
Yeah, you can have someone do a phone check-in, call me in 5 minutes, make sure everything's going okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And if I may say, as we're getting into the next section of the outline, I don't want to paint a terrible picture and scare people off from becoming a housing provider, of course. But I think this is it's a reality that we just need to, I think it's probably best forewarned, and so on that note, we'll talk a little bit about identifying different types of problem tenants, and that hope happens over time. Doesn't happen all at once, even if we might like to have all perfect information up front, right? We don't. It's always going to be asymmetrical in one way or another. And we'll get into some tips on how to work and deal with tenants. And as a housing provider, you'll be dealing with contractors as well, people working to maintain the property, and then state and town officials. We'll just have a couple of notes about that. It's not like dealing with them, but just to be prepared that it's a significant mindset to get into. And then we'll talk a
And I was
little
just
bit
going
about
to say,
communication.
we had Sue
Go ahead.
Fillion, the planning director in Brattleboro, on the call on Tuesday. So it was really great. I definitely recommend going back and sort of listening to her, because she presents a really kind of matter-of-fact presentation about why and when you might need to, just from a point of some perspectives, why you might need to deal with your town in terms of, checking in about buying a building and doing work on the building. And then, of course, other types of state and town officials you might run into later down the road. But she gave some good advice. All right.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, and so this is all, a package of ideas of, what you need to be thinking about if you're thinking of becoming a landlord. And I must say, it's not for everyone. That's basically my point, but it can be for people who, enjoy a challenge and enjoy the idea of really working in the community to solve problems. I think if you find yourself as a problem solver, you'll probably do well as a housing provider. And on that note, we're going to talk about problem tenants. It's another word for it is, there are different words for it, but you can help tenants not become or not be problem tenants. And I just want to put that out there. These are sort of worst case scenarios. Okay. And again, these things develop over time, and you're going to be the one observing and documenting when you have already leased someone up. Okay. And here's just a sort of a few types. There are definitely more that you might come up with, having to do with when and how you pay rent, and then damaging DIYers. That's, there are folks who will take it upon themselves to repair or replace or alter a unit, and that's something you need to be on the lookout for. Subletting and visitors, the typical limit for visitors in a lease is 14 days. You can write what you'd like into your lease. And then the other more extreme issue would be essentially subletting, and whether you're allowing that or not, or if it's considered legal. And then there are such folks who are identified as expert complainers, and that usually follows a pattern. And again, you want to be documenting things in general, positive and negative, but that I think will help you identify when this becomes an issue. And another sort of a chronic situation might be rule breakers, people who are violating the lease regularly. You know, they may be following the what is it, the letter of the rule or the letter of the law, but not the intention. So they may still be breaking the rules. And then you may need to be on the lookout sometimes about actual law breakers in, you know, whether it is a function of your unit in the community or that person in the community. It's definitely worth being aware that you will become you'll become you'll have a role in that situation, perhaps. Any comments about that?
Go for it, John.
I would probably just add that it's always great to, as a housing provider, to get to know the neighbors of your buildings.
Mm-hmm.
And when they see that, you know, you care, and if there are noise complaints and, you know, from your building, handling those so that the neighbors see that you're acting on those. Because, you know, if you can make sure that you are a good neighbor to those neighbors as the building owner, they actually watch out for your property. I can't tell you how many calls we've gotten, or the neighbors have actually contacted the police for something that most people probably would just have turned their heads and said, well, that's their building, you know, their broken window or something like that, and not caring. Whereas the neighbors of some of our buildings are calling the cops and calling us and saying, just wanted to let you know. And, you know, it's because they obviously care about their neighborhood, but if they also care about me as their neighbor, you know, even though I'm not living there, you know, I make decisions about that property. And so they consider me their neighbor. And if I can treat them with respect, they'll treat me with the same. And so that's always a benefit as well. So.
Yeah, one of the biggest mistakes I made in land and being a housing provider was my first building that I turned into. It was a 3-unit and I bought it, and I lived in one and rented out the other 2. And then I moved to a single family house and rented out the 3rd unit. I failed to pay attention. I did not hear from my tenants. They paid their rent on time. Everything seemed to be going fine until one set decided they wanted to move, and I went over to the building, probably the first time in a year. And I was stunned and disappointed and disheartened at what had happened. Come to find out, so were my neighbors, but they weren't telling me.
Mm.
So that what John just said, make a rapport with the neighbors, let them know that you care about the neighborhood and what's going on, and pay attention. You need to check on the property more than once a year. It's imperative for both your financial stability as well as just being able to take care of the property appropriately and have the right people in the building. Because that was the other thing that had happened. Other people were living in the unit and I did not know that, you know, so they were more than just who I leased to. It's so easy to become complacent when you don't live in the building or the neighborhood, and you need to guard yourself from that.
That certainly is one of the benefits of investing in properties that are in the same town or close enough. You know, Jeff quite often, like on his way to work, he'll just drive through the town by our various properties.
Yeah, I do that.
Just that's part of his daily drive to work. It only takes 5 minutes. It's, you know, and it's just going down a few different blocks that are not on the way to work, but they're close enough by that it doesn't add a lot of time. And then when the neighbors see that you're driving by almost on a daily basis, and the tenants see that you're driving by on a daily basis, and then, it lets them know that you care. And it took literally 5 minutes out of your day. So you don't have to think about, well, I need to go check on, but it doesn't have to be a chore. And if you do it often enough, it just gets easier and easier. But as Susan said, if it's just once a year or once every quarter, there's a lot that they can get away with, and they know that they will probably never see you. So
Exactly.
good points.
Yeah, and if I may say, there's sort of the opposite of the complainer, which is you hear nothing, which I think is what you're both referring to. You want to be paying attention to fill in the gap of what you're not hearing as well. And it takes time. I mean, even if it's a little time, it's, takes the motivation to do it for sure.
Built that into my leases that the tenants need to inform me of issues with the building. I don't care if they think they can fix them or not. Know what's going on with the building as a whole. Because it's not just that one unit, it's everything else, all the other components that keep it going. And if they're doing their own plumbing and not telling me that we have a plumbing issue, that's not working for me.
Right. Yeah. And it could be dangerous bring it back to the safety, electrical, plumbing, all the basic things that you do want to know about. You can have some of that written into your lease, as you're saying, to, things to encourage them to tell you about repairs that are required to prevent some of those from becoming worse. So yeah, and again, I think we're basically talking about your attentiveness, your level of willingness to address these things over time. But if we're talking about how good landlords, let's say good, I know that, but this was assigned as becoming a landlord, but you're right, we could say good housing providers. These are just some tips on what a practiced communicator, let's say, might be doing with difficult people in general, right? Or what we call problem tenants, right? But again, we're trying to work toward solving problems. So I'll just sort of summarize some of these bullet points here. If you're working as a landlord, you're constantly challenged by this need to either put yourself in someone else's shoes, so change your perspective, consider that they might have different priorities than you. They may have different patterns, such as, let's say, working at night versus day shift and so forth, right? Just having that openness about that your perspective is limited is important here. Being an advocate, not an adversary, and that you can always come back to the idea that you are, you're not choosing sides here. You are an advocate for safe living in this building or the unit, on the side of safety. And sometimes there are other safety rules that you can adhere to that really aren't your doing. It's just that you need to keep a safe building. While someone's explaining something to you, though, you're actively listening to them, and you're going to list off some actions of what you're going to do. I generally believe in undercommitting and over-delivering, right? But you can commit as much as you want as long as you can do it, right? I believe you should follow through, as one of the other terms on that word cloud mentioned, following through on what you say you're going to do, and when you're listening to what they're requesting, and that you let them know that you are taking them seriously, and you typically shouldn't take things personally, and although that's difficult to do, I think documentation, just the very act of typing things out or writing them down, can be very healthy. So, you know, if you do need to find some personal vindication, then maybe just doing that act of taking their concerns down on paper in front of people sometimes, right? Just writing it down or typing it, putting it in your phone, whatever. Documenting things can just indicate that you are taking someone seriously. And by the way, even if their concerns don't seem to be terribly serious, you should take them seriously. And just as a note, as we all know about fair housing rules, you know, discrimination of any kind is not just unkind, but you know, the legality of these things is very clear in fair housing laws. So I think interpretation of your actions might, you know, you just need to be very aware of all of the previous things will help prevent any concerns about discrimination. And then second on this list here, you know, working with working with town officials, state officials, contractors, people who are concerned with your level of property management is really a matter of managing those relationships too. You know, so you're getting to know the fire marshal in some way. They have your phone number, right? Or your contractors and so forth. You have a sense of what their time frames are. It's important to keep those things in mind, and wanting and really having the incentive on your part to manage those relationships. And just, I'm not going to go into code enforcement issues, fire, health and safety issues and so forth, but the idea that town officials, state officials, and contractors are all held to certain building codes, electrical, plumbing, etc. It's for everyone's safety, yours and the tenants. And sometimes these are just reminders that you need to keep yourself going with, I think, as you're working with all these folks. I just felt like I wanted to comprehensively go through those, but are there any things that you guys would want to add to that?
I don't think so. I mean, you know, in terms of dealing with contractors, you know, obviously, you know, we know that there's not enough of them out there. And it is difficult to get them, and they're scheduled, they have, you know, backlogs, but, you know, my other job is, you know, I work for an insulation contractor, and, you know, certainly when I think about clients who call us looking for work, you know, you want to know that the client is looking for the right work to be done, that they're not looking for the cheapest work to be done, and that they're not going to go out and get 10 estimates and compare you based on price. And so as a housing provider, you know, I'm looking to create a relationship with a set of contractors. I have an electrician that will be my go-to electrician. I'm not going to try to get prices from 3 different electricians every time I need electrical work. Same with the plumbers. And, you know, so when you can build a relationship and a team of people, then that way, when you call and they know that you know, the only call you're making is to them, they will respond pretty quickly, because they know that you will have, particularly if you have multiple units, that you'll have other work for them, and you know that they as well. And then in terms of town, you know, working with town officials, you know, also understanding that when they see that you're doing our tenants with the buildings themselves, keeping them safe.
Oh, John, you're starting to, your internet is flagging a tiny bit.
I think the point is well taken, though,
Right.
John. Very, very well said.
Yes.
Do the right thing. They'll do right by you.
Yeah, yeah. And if I were to create a Venn diagram
Yes,
of
John,
these
for a minute.
two groups, by the way, it's worth noting that contractors being very busy and so forth, you may think that they're being difficult with you. That you may think that they are difficult people, but they may just have a very difficult job, a very difficult set of circumstances, and just again changing that perspective, even working with them is important.
And one of the things that I'm running into lately, I'll get a phone call. I put in for a plumbing job and it's a pretty extensive job, and it's going to impact the whole building and a couple tenants. It's going to impact the whole building from one perspective, but also two tenants from needing to get into their room, into their units. And my fear is that they're going to tell me, no, you can't at that time because I'm not going to be there. I have to impress upon them, if I get a plumber to come to do that work, I need access to that unit, whether you're there or not. And I'm not going to be able to accommodate your presence in order to get this essential work done. Stuff like electrical and plumbing, that's not stuff that you put off forever. When you can get a contractor there who's qualified and able to do the work, you do it then. You don't say, oh no, never mind, go find something else to do that day because my tenant isn't available to hang out. So I haven't run into that yet, but it's one of those things that, again, managing expectations.
Mm-hmm.
They understand that this stuff is important and that the building's safety as well as their use of the building matters. And in order to facilitate that, this is what we need to do now. You talk a little bit about property management is a relationship management too. Property management is kind of a new field for me. I've only been doing it now for 3 years on this scale, and I probably overdo because I don't just write leases and collect rent money. So it's important to do a good thorough job for your client, the property owner. And code enforcement, I've developed a really good relationship with all of them, and that is very important. You understand their expectations and that they understand your commitment to keeping the building safe for everybody involved. And that's critical to successful multifamily ownership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the reason I'm putting these in here, by the way, is that I think all of this goes with the job, or the business, whatever you want to call it. It's something you're signing up for, if, to become a good landlord, for sure. And it's all really interesting, fascinating stuff for some people. For some people, they don't want to get in this deep. I think we can all understand why that would be. Sorry, this is another version of that. Last but not least, just to talk a little bit about communication, there are some tasks involved in being a landlord, and we can talk about some tips as well. I'm going to get to that little image in the cover of Talib's book there at the end here. But your basic goal is you are sharing and you are gaining information. You do want to see it as trying to overcome barriers that get in the way of communication. So you may want to talk about with someone who you trust how your phone communication works for them, or not. Virtual communication like this video stuff, you may want to talk about that. Inspections, as we've talked about, you can do drive-bys. You also want to schedule in, according to statute, you do want to do 48-hour notice for any inspections. at the very least, but you should schedule them in advance. Some people do virtual inspections because I think, as Sue was alluding to, people have well, not just schedules, but they have concerns about people coming into their space. So if you're open to doing a virtual inspection of a unit, that's a possibility. And then if anyone's concerned about getting sick because of, lack of social distancing in an indoor situation, there are other contactless ways of doing that in person and online, any sort of interaction you're making. And then you want to think just as a sort of a timeline. I didn't get into the timeline issues, but you have that initial contact when you're doing your screening and interviewing and leasing up. You have ongoing, and then you have your final contact. I mean, maybe not completely final, but at least as a tenant, perhaps you at some point are planning to say goodbye to this person, and that at that point you've already given a reference to another landlord. So that second to last there, you need to be preparing yourself to give a reference for your tenants to other landlords. Those can be written, or they can be verbal. And that's where you're even sharing more information that you should be careful about how you are conveying that information. And last but not least, I'm just going to make a plug for Nassim Taleb's book, Skin in the Game. It's not explicitly about landlording, but it is about that asymmetrical information problem in all of our daily lives. And just making the point, he makes the point very clearly that, having a personal stake in the topic, the investment, the issue that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, he calls it having skin in the game, but having a personal stake in protecting this investment, protecting your own integrity, protecting your involvement in the community. I think really is a useful way to do that is to start with safety. And I guess I'll, just want to leave it open to anybody who might have some thoughts on other tips. This is focused on communication loosely, but sharing and gaining information is kind of the overall goal here.
So, one of the things I wanted to go back to for a second, or as part of this too, is communication. I often encourage the tenants, if they have an issue with a neighbor, that they should try to resolve it amongst themselves, because that's the most efficient way of making sure that both parties can agree. If I start to get in the middle of it, one or the other is always both of them will accuse me of taking sides. So it's better if they can resolve their own conflict. What I make clear to them is that if I have to become involved to resolve a conflict that they can't seem to manage, that there may be steps that neither one of them would appreciate I might need to take for the whole building. So, I try to have those communications in person so that they can understand and see my sincerity. But I also put stuff in writing, because that's the ultimate tool that you take and say, this is what I told you, and this is what I put in writing. They match. This is what you need to pay attention to. And I try to, but I'm not so good at it. I try to document my daily interactions with people so that, if there's ever a question that comes up, that I can say, this is what I said and this is what I did for this situation. I'm a firm believer in having in-person inspections, because there's the nuances that you may not be aware of. Even something as simple as they call them drain flies now, but fruit flies and infestation, that can affect the whole building. So that kind of stuff you may not see on a visual tour. And it's all because I need to protect the investment. I need to protect myself. I need to protect my investment, and I really need to protect everybody who is in that building for their safety and well-being.
Well said, nothing to add there.
I'm sorry, I was muted. That sounds good. I think it's really important. I think I like to hear all the stuff about just really being open in communication and being, in person, and, these are personal relationships. And I think, just as remembering too, as a housing provider, like housing feels very personal. So if anyone who's experienced, moving into an apartment or moving out or buying a home, it's a strange interaction, because it's both like financial, but also it's where you live. And so that's a very emotional, you have a very emotional attachment to it. So I think it's an interesting space. And I think a lot of people are really excited about doing that. And I think those are people who are good landlords, who are excited about being in that space where it's this funny intersection between the emotional and the financial. It's a very interesting space.
One thing I think what's important for people who are contemplating becoming housing providers or even property managers, form a relationship with someone who's been in the business a while, and ask them if they'll be your mentor, or that they can call you with questions. There's nothing like experience. That's a really good teacher. They don't allow you to deduct education for life education as part of your tax deduction, but you can certainly learn from it and pass it on to others.
Yeah, or if there's a landlord group in your community, join that. And it doesn't have to be strictly landlord
No.
group. There could be some other organization in town that is working on improving the town through development, or just, through other relationships. Get involved in other activities in the community, because you will meet other housing providers, other business owners, other contractors. You will meet lots of people in those other organizations that are ultimately people that you can, as Sue said, call with questions, or bring in for any help that you need.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's so much more to it than just this, but these are just some tips and some thoughts to keep in mind, that there's so much to learn and experience. And so with that, I did want to open it up if we had any other ideas. This is just a little visual for giggles, I guess, but things like screens and bugs and whatever, as Sue mentioned, are always things to keep an eye out for. But these are just sort of things to think about if you are thinking about becoming a landlord. That you can learn from other landlords for sure, but state and local agencies who oversee housing issues in general, code enforcement, you can learn a lot from them as well. And that, at least in Vermont, landlords really are a key component in enforcing those housing codes, and so getting back to the safety issues, especially given that, we have potential for flooding damage and for all sorts of things that are out of our control, or at least that we can't immediately control. We want to think about how we can help improve the housing infrastructure as landlords. But if you guys have any other ideas, or I just wanted to end on kind of a lighter note, but.
Thanks, Dan. I wanted to apologize for any poor connections. I got dropped off there for a little bit. We have multiple people in the household trying to attend multiple Zoom meetings,
Right,
which doesn't work well in our rural communities always. So I apologize.
it barely dropped out, so I think it held on.
Good.
Yeah.
You know, I think being a landlord, it's a double-edged sword. It's been the most satisfying experience, short of raising my two sons, but it's also been the most frustrating. Because there are, you feel like if you have a bad experience, you feel like you let somebody down. If you have had a bad tenant, or you know, you need to do something not so pleasant, you feel like you've let somebody down, that it's not uh, and that's not how most of us operate. We're not just in it for just the money. We also view it as not a social thing, but more as a profession, I guess, if I can throw the professional piece of it into it, and we take it seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always good to be known as the landlord who takes good care of the properties and also cares about the people. That's a good thing to have in the community, as well as with the state and local officials. Um, they will talk to you, they will work with you, and they'll help out as best they can.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Sue. And, you know, a lot of people certainly do try to get into being a housing provider for the financial aspect. But I think if your mindset is that you are providing something to your community, you know, if you go in understanding that it's not just about getting tenants and collecting rent and depositing those checks and, you know, making improvements when you need to and repairs, you know, that you are, you know, as Sue said, you're a business in your community, you're providing housing in your community. Dan showed us how important housing is. I mean, homes matter. And you look at, you know, the tagline, the website for Windham Windsor Housing Trust, and it's that way for a reason. And you can think about maybe times in your life where you may have lived in housing that wasn't up to par, and, you know, other things in your life got affected by that. And the converse is true. When you have a very safe and very comfortable place to live, other aspects in your life actually start improving, and you start to realize that. So if those sorts of things really energize you, that you can be involved in your community, you can provide better housing to people, you can make a huge impact on people's lives. And if the financial piece comes after all of those, you will be highly successful. Um, and so but as Sue said, there are times where you can be really frustrated. People, and inevitably, we all get let down at some point in our lives by somebody, and there will be those moments. But they're all teachable moments. They're all things that you gain. You know, Sue and I have all gained from the mistakes that we've made. We've gained from mistakes that our tenants have made, because it's knowledge. We learned a lesson. We got better because of those things. Um, so yeah, it's not an easy job. It is a rewarding job. It is a frustrating job, but all of those things add up to being more successful tomorrow and the next day. Um, so, you know, I hope that more and more people, more and more young people will get involved in being housing providers. And it is a stepping stone to being able to potentially own your own single family property, which is pretty hard to do as a young person these days, almost impossible. You know, so this is a way that you can get some experience in taking care of a building. You can have somebody help you pay those bills. If you're living in that property and you have a rental, just as Sue said, one of her first buildings, she lived in it and then moved on to a different building, and, you know, and then you have that asset. And so there are it's certainly the best way to be able to um, kind of follow that American dream, be able to provide something for other people, have an impact on your community, all of those things. So it's more than just being a housing provider, I guess, is the short story of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, John, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because this is my last slide. And I was hoping we would have, and I hope there will be viewers of this video who are younger. The issue that often comes up with discussing becoming a landlord, and which I'm taking pains to avoid, is how much rent should you charge and all the financial gains you can make out of a property. Of course, you have to pay the bills, but and it is a business. But the context for this, as you just mentioned, is that one of the ways that, let's just say, the millennial generation, who are the most rent cost burdened in the country, and this is a little map of where they are the most cost burdened. Notice that Vermont and the Northeast in general is not there. It's a huge issue, and I think you're exactly right that this is one way for younger folks to move forward with their own housing needs, to purchase a multifamily, for sure.
And I think, getting all the knowledge you can. And so we'll share all these recordings and these links, and, encourage landlord groups, to hold watch parties for prospective landlords or, housing providers, because it really is important to understand kind of the full spectrum. So I think, I don't know if we have much more to add. We're just about at time, but I really appreciate you three coming on and sharing this really good information, but also a good philosophy. I think that's really important. And one of the things I think we've stressed consistently for people who will stick it out and watch the whole series is that having a team of people there to help you is super important. So gathering that team and using your community as a resource is 100% important. We, encourage that. And it's one of the things that my program does here. Why is a economy project talking about housing? Because housing is really important to our economy, to our communities, and to the people that live in them. So if there's any questions ever, I'm sure any of the people that have presented on our series are more than happy to answer questions, and we will, make connections. My job is to make connections for people. So reach out, and thank you so much for presenting. And hopefully, we can send this into the world in a way that is really going to help people get started and be able to afford owning property, which is, as you pointed out, not easy today. Not easy in Vermont. So thank you, guys.
Way to
Thank you,
wrap up.
everyone.
Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you very much.
Okay, have a good night.